She wore white to her own funeral, not the kind where they lower you into the ground, the kind where an entire town watches you die standing up, in a dress that cost more than your father's last harvest, holding flowers no one will take. Leora Ashcombe stood at the altar of Crestfield's only church, while the minutes stretched into something unbearable, and every person in those pews slowly understood what she was only beginning to accept. He wasn't coming, not late, not delayed, gone. A folded note passed hand to hand through the crowd like an apology for a dinner party. That was all Edmund Voss left behind. 24 years old, and her entire life had just been canceled by a messenger. If you've ever been left behind by someone who was supposed to stay, this story is for you. Watch until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The dress had taken 3 weeks to finish. Leora knew because she'd counted, not out of vanity, but because every evening after supper she'd sat beside the seamstress, Mrs. Halverson, watching the woman's thick fingers pull white cotton thread through ivory fabric by lamplight. It was the only wedding preparation Leora had truly enjoyed. Everything else, the negotiations between Edmund's mother and the church deacon, the guest list that somehow kept growing to include people Leora had never met, the menu decisions that felt less like celebration and more like a business dinner, all of it had carried a strange, hollow feeling she'd learned to push down and ignore. But the dress felt real. She stood in front of the cracked mirror in the back room of the Halverson house on the morning of June 14th, and for a moment, just one, she let herself believe it was all going to be fine. The dress fit the way things rarely fit in real life. The sleeves fell right. The hem grazed the floor at exactly the correct length without bunching at her ankles. Even her hair, which had always resisted anything resembling cooperation, had been pinned into something that looked almost intentional. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Halverson said from the doorway, her voice soft but careful. The voice of a woman who understood that some compliments carry weight. "Thank you," Leora said, and she meant it, even if the word came out quieter than she intended. She was not a woman who dwelled in mirrors. Her father had raised her practical, up before sunrise, hands in the hive boxes by mid-morning, hauling frames and checking brood patterns and tracking honey flow with the same focus other girls her age gave to dances and courtship. Abel Ashcombe had been a small, serious man with large, rough hands and a belief that paying attention was the highest form of respect. He taught her everything he knew about bees, that they were not pets, not tools, not simple creatures to be managed. They were a system, a living intelligence, and the beekeeper's job was to learn their language well enough to help without interfering. He died 14 months ago, quietly, the way he'd done most things, a fever that moved too fast. Leora had sat beside him through 3 nights, and on the 4th morning he was gone. And 2 weeks after the burial, the men from the lending house arrived with papers she didn't fully understand but couldn't argue with. The apiary, 12 hives, 40 acres of wildflower meadow, the small house at the edge of the property where she'd grown up, all of it had been absorbed into a debt she hadn't known existed. She'd had nowhere to go. Edmund Voss had appeared, as he always seemed to, at exactly the right moment. He was handsome in this way that made you trust him before you'd decided to. Dark hair, a straight jaw, the kind of easy confidence that looked like competence from a distance. He ran a dry goods trading operation out of a storefront on Crestfield's main street, and everyone in town seemed to think well of him. His mother especially thought well of him, loudly, regularly, and in the company of anyone who would listen. When he'd proposed, Leora had felt something closer to relief than love, and she'd been honest enough with herself to notice that, even if she hadn't been honest enough to say it out loud. She told herself it didn't matter, that love was something people built over time, that stability and kindness were enough of a foundation, that she was being practical, the way her father had raised her to be. She'd been wrong about what practical meant. The church was full. Crestfield was not a large town, 300 and some souls if you counted the outlying farms, but it seemed like most of them had crammed themselves into the whitewashed building on Morrow Street that morning. Leora walked in on the arm of her father's old friend, Henry Kraft, who was the closest thing to family she had left, and she felt the eyes of the congregation like a physical pressure. People smiled. That was the thing she remembered afterward, with a bitterness she couldn't entirely shake. They all smiled when she walked in. Warm, encouraging smiles. the smiles of people who believed they were witnessing a happy occasion. She reached the front of the church and turned to face the doors. Edmund was not there. She assumed he was simply running behind. Edmund was occasionally disorganized. He'd been late to 2 of their dinners together, had forgotten a planned meeting once, had a quality of slight carelessness about time that his mother excused as being a man of business, always pulled in many directions. Leora had found it mildly irritating, but not alarming. She waited. A minute passed, then another. The organist played the same introductory passage 3 times, each repetition slightly more strained than the last. The deacon, Pastor Hillard, a thin man with a red nose who always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, kept glancing toward the door with an expression that was trying very hard to remain neutral. After 10 minutes, the murmuring began. It was quiet at first. A few whispers in the back pews, heads turning, the shuffling of feet. Leora stood very still at the front of the church and stared at the closed door and told herself there was a reasonable explanation. A delay on the road, a problem at the trading post, something ordinary, something fixable, something that would resolve itself in the next few minutes and become the story they laughed about at anniversary dinners for decades to come. Remember when Edmund was late to the wedding? Remember how terrified I was for those 15 minutes? She was still constructing this future memory when the door opened. Not Edmund. A boy, 12 or 13, wearing a dust-smeared shirt and a look of profound discomfort, walked up the center aisle with a folded piece of paper held in front of him like a weapon he didn't want to be carrying. He stopped in front of Henry Kraft, who took the note with a slow, deliberate movement and opened it. Leora watched Henry's face as he read. She watched it go still. "Henry," she said quietly, just to him. He looked up at her, and something in his expression, not pity exactly, but the shadow of it, told her everything she needed to know before he said a word. "It's for you," he said. "From Edmund." She took the note. The paper was ordinary, slightly crumpled at one corner as though it had been folded and refolded. Edmund's handwriting was sharp and angular, the letters pressed hard into the page. "Leora, I find I cannot go through with this. I am sorry for the inconvenience. I have left Crestfield. I think it best we do not correspond. E. Voss." She read it twice. Inconvenience. He had used the word inconvenience. She became aware slowly that the church had gone completely silent. 300 people, or close enough to it, were watching her read the note that had just canceled her future, and the silence was so total she could hear the candles on the altar hissing softly in the still air. She folded the note. She folded it very carefully, creasing the edges, making it small and flat. She did not know why she did this. Her hands needed something to do. Her brain had stalled somewhere between the first reading and the second, and her body was running on a kind of automatic, careful precision that was probably the only thing holding her upright. "Leora," Henry began. "I'm all right," she said. She said it to Henry and to the church and to herself and to no one in particular. She turned around and walked back up the center aisle, past 200 faces that were now wearing expressions she did not have the resources to interpret. Some were horrified, some were sympathetic, some, and these were the ones she noticed most sharply, because human beings notice the cruelest things in their worst moments. Some were already wearing the barely contained energy of people who had just acquired an extraordinary piece of gossip. She walked through the church door. She walked down the 3 wooden steps and into the bright June morning. She kept walking. She walked for a long time before she let herself stop. The dress was not made for walking, not real walking, the kind she'd done her whole life across meadow grass and muddy paths between hive rows. The hem caught dust and began to gray at the edges almost immediately. Her shoes, borrowed from Mrs. Halverson because her own were too worn for a wedding, pinched badly at the left heel. By the time she reached the edge of town and turned onto the main road heading east, there was a blister forming, and she barely noticed it. The sun was high and white. June in this part of the country was not kind. Dry heat that pressed down from a pale sky. No shade on the open road except where the occasional scrubby cottonwood tree threw a thin, inadequate shadow. She had no hat. She had no money. Her small purse was still sitting on the chair in Mrs. Halverson's back room where she'd gotten dressed. She had the note in her left hand, still folded into that precise flat rectangle, an address that was becoming less white by the minute, and nowhere in particular to go. The land around Crestfield was open country, broad scrubland broken by distant hills, a few farmsteads set back from the road behind wire fencing, cattle standing in the middle distance with the absolute placid emptiness that only cattle achieve. It was objectively beautiful country, and Lyora had loved it her whole life. Right now, she was not able to see it. She was replaying this morning in a way that her brain would not stop doing regardless of how much she wanted it to. The dress being finished, the mirror, the walk up the aisle, 10 minutes. She'd stood there for 10 minutes. She'd stood there and waited and constructed hopeful explanations while an entire town watched her be abandoned, and now she stopped walking. Not because she'd decided to, but because her legs simply paused, the way a person's body sometimes insists on taking stock before the mind is ready. She stood in the middle of the road and looked at the folded note in her hand, and felt something move through her that wasn't quite grief, and wasn't quite rage, and wasn't quite humiliation, but was some ugly combination of all three that didn't have a proper name. I find I cannot go through with this. She opened her hand and let the note fall. The paper caught a small gust of dust wind, tumbled twice, and came to rest against the dirt of the road. She stared at it for a moment, then she walked on and left it there. She walked until the afternoon began to cool and her heel was bleeding inside Mrs. Halverson's borrowed shoe, and the dress had moved from ivory to a dusty gray beige that bore no resemblance to its original color. She walked until the road dipped into a shallow hollow between two low hills, and the cottonwood trees thickened along what might have been a seasonal creek bed, and the shade was suddenly real and heavy and welcome. She sat down on the edge of the road, not elegantly. Her legs simply gave the project up, and she sat in the dust with her wedding dress spread out around her like a collapsed sail, her back against a fence post, and she put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She wanted to. There was pressure behind her eyes and a thickness in her chest that ordinarily preceded tears, but nothing came. She sat there in the hot dust beside a road she hadn't planned to be on, and felt something worse than crying, a kind of hollowed-out stillness, as though all the feeling had gone somewhere she couldn't reach it. The apiary was gone. Her father was gone. The house where she'd grown up was someone else's property now, and the one future she'd arranged for herself, the practical, sensible, sufficient future, it had been folded into a small piece of paper and delivered by a 12-year-old boy in a dust-smeared shirt. She had, to the best of her knowledge, nothing. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the creak of wheels on dry road, the slow, steady rhythm of a horse that wasn't being pushed, not hurrying anywhere. The sound came from behind her, from the direction of town, and she was suddenly, painfully aware of how she must look. A woman in a filthy wedding dress sitting in the dust at the side of the road like something the frontier had simply discarded. She considered getting up and walking away before the wagon reached her. She had enough dignity left to feel that impulse. But her legs declined to cooperate, and the wagon was moving steadily, and within another minute it had slowed alongside her and stopped. She looked up. The man on the wagon seat was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said what she was expecting. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, lean in the way that came from work rather than appetite, with sun-darkened skin and forearms that looked like they were made of rope. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting, a few days of beard that wasn't quite intentional, and a face that was not exactly handsome, but was the kind of face you found yourself looking at and then not wanting to stop looking at, because it was a face that appeared to be engaged in some ongoing quiet act of thought. He was looking at her, not with shock or amusement or pity, with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Something careful, something that was paying attention without deciding what to make of things yet. The silence stretched for several seconds. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. That was all. No performance of courtesy, no obvious calculation about how to handle the situation, no attempt to cushion or frame the question. Just the plain fact of it, offered into the air between them. She should have been irritated. She was a stranger on a road, not a lost dog. But the question was so completely without pretense that she found she couldn't manufacture irritation. She looked at him and thought, this man actually wants to know the answer. "No," she said. He nodded, as though this confirmed something he'd already considered. His horse, a plain bay, older, with the easy patience of an animal that had worked hard its whole life without complaint, shifted its weight and twitched an ear at a fly. "I run an orchard," he said, "about 4 miles east. Apple and pear, mostly. It's not much. He paused. I'm Garrick Rowan. Leora Ashcombe. He looked at her dress, or rather, at what the dress had become over the course of her long walk. Then he looked at her face, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being read accurately by someone who wasn't being rude about it. I'm not looking for charity, she said, before he could say whatever came next. I'm not offering it, he said. I'm short-handed. Have been for 2 seasons. She looked at him. What kind of short-handed? The kind where the orchard's dying and I can't figure out why fast enough to stop it. He held her gaze without apology or drama, just plain statement. Someone told me once it was a pollination problem. I don't know enough about that to fix it myself. Something shifted in her chest. Not dramatically, not the movie version of recognition, swelling and significant, more like a small latch clicking in the dark. What do you know about bees? She asked. For the first time, the corners of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. I know I don't have any, he said. She looked at the road ahead, 4 miles east. She looked at her hands, the hands her father had taught to work hive frames before she was tall enough to see over the top of a brood box. She looked at the dust caked in the folds of the wedding dress that had cost more than she could afford and had bought her nothing. All right, she said. She stood up, somewhat less gracefully than she would have liked, and brushed what dust she could from the dress, which was a nearly pointless exercise but gave her hands something to do. The dress is going to be a problem, she said. I don't have other clothes. Mrs. Rowan left some things, he said. You're welcome to them if they fit. She almost asked, then didn't. There was something in the way he said left that didn't invite follow-up questions, and she was not, at this particular moment, in any position to be asking other people about painful subjects. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. They didn't talk much on the 4-mile ride. That suited her. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had both recently been reminded that words frequently failed to cover the ground they claimed to. The afternoon light softened and turned amber around the edges, and the scrubland gave way gradually to something greener where underground water gathered closer to the surface, and then the road curved around a low hill and the orchard appeared. It was not impressive. She would think about that later. How her first sight of it was not a beautiful revelation, but something more honest than that. The trees were planted in long, uneven rows on gently sloping ground, and they were struggling. She could see it from the road. The leaves were thin, the color wrong. A yellowish green that meant stress, probably drought compounded by something else. The grass between the rows had gone to stubble. Some branches showed a peculiar premature brittleness. It was an orchard that was losing an argument with the land it sat on. But it was also, she could see this too, underneath the struggle, an orchard with good bones. Old trees, deep-rooted. The kind of trees that had been there long enough to have opinions. The kind of land that remembered what it was supposed to do. She looked at it for a long moment as the wagon pulled up the lane toward a low wooden farmhouse. How long has it been like this? She asked. 3 years declining, Garrick said. Bad the first year, worse the second. This year I wasn't sure there'd be a harvest worth putting up. Have you had bees here before? My father kept 3 hives. They died out before I took the property over. He paused. That was 7 years ago. 7 years without pollinators, and 3 years of visible decline. The math was straightforward. The trees were starving for something that cost nothing except knowledge and patience. She felt the familiar, steady pull of a problem her skills were built for. I'll need equipment, she said. Hive boxes, frames, foundation, protective gear. It's not cheap. I know, Garrick said. He said it without complaint, which was notable. And I'll need time. You can't fix 7 years in 1 season. I understand that. She turned to look at him, trying to figure him out. He was not what she'd expected from a man offering help to a woman he'd found sitting in the road in a ruined wedding dress. Most men in her experience either wanted something obvious in return or wanted to feel generous in a way that was ultimately about them. He seemed to want neither. He seemed to simply be attempting to solve 2 problems, hers and his, with the same practical offer. Why are you doing this? She asked. He considered the question without deflecting it, which she appreciated. Because my orchard is dying and I need help I don't have, he said, and because you were sitting in the road and I asked you a question and you answered it honestly. He looked ahead at the farmhouse. And my father used to say that people who answer honestly deserve an honest offer in return. She didn't know what to make of him. She wasn't sure she needed to yet. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the farmhouse. The house itself was plain and somewhat worn. The porch needed attention, and one of the shutters on the east-facing window had lost a hinge and been wired rather than fixed. But it was solid. Whoever had built it to last. Garrick jumped down and tied the horse. Then he turned and offered a hand up to Leora. Not in the performative, courtly way she'd seen men offer women assistance, but in the practical way of someone who knew that climbing down from a wagon seat in a long dress was a legitimate logistical challenge. She took the hand, climbed down. "Bunkhouse is separate," he said. "You'd have your own space. My neighbor Elsa Holt comes out Tuesdays to help with the house. She'll know where everything is." "All right," she said. "I'll pay you what I can," he said. "It won't be much at first." "I don't need much at first," she said. They stood for a moment in front of the farmhouse in the amber late afternoon light, two strangers who had arrived at an arrangement through the most unconventional possible route, both of them understanding that the arrangement was fragile and would require care. "One more thing," Leora said. "What's that?" "I need to know if you respect the work," she said. "Not the results. I can't promise the results for a good while yet. The work itself. The knowledge. Because if you're going to think of me as a hired hand doing simple labor, we're going to have problems." He looked at her steadily. "My father respected this land," he said. "I respect what it takes to understand something that doesn't explain itself to you. Whatever you know about bees," he gestured toward the struggling orchard. "That's not simple." She nodded. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a declaration. It was two people agreeing to try something, which was honestly more than she'd had this morning. Well, the bunkhouse was small and dusty from disuse. Leora spent the first hour opening the single window and beating the mattress and finding a broom in the corner and making the space functional in the way that keeping her hands busy had always helped her think. By the time the light through the window had gone orange and low, the room was no cleaner in any meaningful sense, but she felt less like she'd been dropped into someone else's abandoned life. Elsa Holt, who turned out to live on the neighboring property and apparently felt no obligation to restrict her Tuesday visits to actual Tuesdays, appeared at the bunkhouse door around supper time with a covered dish and an expression of frank curiosity that she made no effort to disguise. She was a stout woman in her 50s with a sun-weathered face and gray hair that had clearly given up on whatever arrangement it had started the day in. She looked at Leora for a moment, the remains of the wedding dress, which Leora had changed out of, in favor of a plain work dress she'd found in the farmhouse that fit close enough. And her eyes said everything she was tactful enough not to immediately voice. "Chicken stew," she said, holding out the dish. "Nothing fancy." "Thank you," Leora said. "You didn't have to—" "Garrick told me what happened," Elsa said, not unkindly, but without ceremony. "Or what he knew of it, which wasn't much. He said you were a beekeeper." "My father was," Leora said. "I worked with him my whole life." "What happened to the apiary?" "Debt," Leora said simply. Elsa nodded. She had the manner of a woman who had accumulated enough experience that simple explanations for bad situations did not surprise her. "You're going to hear talk," she said, "from town, about what happened this morning. People around here love a story." "I know," Leora said. "Some of it won't be kind." "I know that too." Elsa studied her for another moment. Then something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a door does when someone decides the person on the other side is worth admitting. "Well," she said, "you'll hear some talk about Garrick too while you're at it, about his wife. Her name was Caroline. She passed 3 years ago. Fever, same as took a lot of people that winter. He hasn't been the same since, which is expected. Some people think he's given up on the orchard on purpose. I don't." She paused. "But I thought you should know the shape of things you're walking into." Leora considered this. "Thank you for telling me." Elsa set the dish down on the small table beside the bed. "Eat something," she said. "You look like you've been walking all day in the wrong shoes." "I have been," Leora said. "Then eat and sleep, and tomorrow things will look at least a little different." She moved toward the door. "They might not look better, but different When she was gone, Leora sat on the edge of the narrow bunk with the bowl of stew and ate in the quiet. Outside the small window, the orchard was visible in the last light, those struggling rows of trees going still and dark as the sun pulled itself below the western hills. She looked at them for a long time. 7 years without bees. She thought about what that meant, about what happened to a living system when you took out a piece it needed. About the way her father had explained, when she was small enough that she sat on his knee to listen, that a bee and a flower had been making the same deal for longer than anyone could measure, that they had shaped each other over so many thousands of years that neither could quite manage without the other anymore. They need each other, he'd said. Not because someone told them to, because they figured it out. She scraped the bottom of the bowl clean and set it aside. She was 24 years old. She had been publicly humiliated in front of most of the people she knew. She had no money, no home that was hers, no family left. She had arrived at a stranger's farm in a ruined dress and arranged to sleep in a bunkhouse and eat borrowed food. She had also, unless she was badly wrong, just looked at a problem she knew how to solve. It wasn't everything. It wasn't close to everything, but it was a start. And starting had always been, her father taught her, the only part that was entirely within your control. She lay back on the narrow bunk and looked at the rough ceiling boards and let herself think about hive placement, about which direction the orchard rows ran relative to the prevailing wind, about where the water source was, because bees needed water close, about how many colonies she'd need to start with, and what she'd find when she opened the land up to their particular kind of attention. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady, she realized, since she'd climbed up onto Garrick Rowan's wagon. The shaking, the thing behind her eyes and in her chest that had threatened to come apart all afternoon, had quieted when she'd had something real to think about. That was something her father had told her too. Bees don't care what happened to you, he'd said. They only care what you know and how you show up. So know your stuff and show up right, and they'll work with you. She closed her eyes. Outside, the orchard stood dark and still and waiting. In the morning, she would begin. She didn't know yet, couldn't know, that the beginning of something genuine rarely feels like a beginning at all. It feels like survival, like putting one foot in front of the other when you have nowhere particular to be putting your feet. The becoming comes later, quietly, without announcement, the way a hive builds itself in the dark, before anyone thinks to look. But that's the thing about bees, they build anyway. The first thing Leora did the next morning was walk the orchard alone. Not with Garrick, not with any explanation or ceremony. She simply rose before the sun had fully committed to the day, pulled on the borrowed work dress, laced up her own shoes, which fit badly, but were at least hers, and walked out into the gray pre-dawn quiet and moved through the trees row by row, slowly, with her hands occasionally brushing the bark of a trunk or lifting a low branch to look at the underside of the leaves. Garrick watched her from the porch with a cup of coffee he didn't offer to share, which she respected. He seemed to understand that this was not a social exercise. She spent 2 hours in the orchard before she came back. He was still on the porch. The coffee was long gone, but he hadn't moved, and she had the impression he'd been waiting not out of impatience, but out of the particular stillness of a man who had learned to wait for things that mattered. "Well," he said. "Your soil's all right," she said. "Better than all right, actually. There's good moisture retention from the slope, and the root systems on the older trees are deep enough that they're not dying of thirst." She paused. "But there's nothing working the blossoms, nothing carrying pollen tree to tree. Whatever your father's 3 hives were doing, they were doing more than anyone realized, and when they died, the orchard didn't collapse immediately, it just slowly stopped being able to do what it's supposed to do." Garrick looked out at the trees. "How long before we'd lose them completely?" 2 more bad seasons," she said. "Maybe 3 if the weather is kind, but the decline isn't going to reverse on its own." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" 8 hive boxes to start," she said. "Frames, wax foundation, entrance reducers. A smoker. Mine went with the apiary. Protective gear for both of us, because I'm going to need help moving equipment, and I won't have you getting stung to death in the first week." She'd thought through the list lying on the bunk before dawn, running it twice to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything obvious. "And bees. I'll need to source nucleus colonies, nukes they're called, from a reputable supplier. There's a man named Decker about 30 miles south who I know is reliable. My father bought from him twice. That's a significant outlay, Garrick said. Not complaining, calculating. I know. And I told you yesterday, you won't see results this season. The colonies need time to establish. The trees need a full bloom cycle with proper pollination before you'll notice the difference in the fruit set. She looked at him directly. I need you to trust the process, even when it doesn't look like it's working. Something crossed his face, a brief, involuntary expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite something else. You sound like you've had to say that before, he said. My father said it constantly, she said. To himself mostly, but I was always listening. Garrick set his empty cup down on the porch rail and looked at the orchard for a moment. I'll take inventory of what I have in the equipment shed, he said. Some things might be salvageable from my father's old setup. Whatever's missing, I'll get. Don't buy cheap frames, she said. It's not worth it. Noted, he said, and went inside. It was a strange beginning to a working arrangement. No contract, no formal terms, no real conversation about what either of them expected beyond the practical exchange of skills for board and modest wages. She thought later that this was probably why it worked, because neither of them had tried to over-define it before it had a chance to find its own shape. The equipment shed yielded 3 old hive boxes that were warped but repairable, a smoker with a cracked bellows that she fixed with a strip of leather she found in the tack room, and a partial veil that was missing its frame but had enough netting to be reconstructed. Garrick's father had kept his tools reasonably, and they were not entirely useless, which was better than she'd expected. She spent 3 days cleaning, repairing, and organizing before anything could be called ready. On the 4th day, Garrick came back from town with a wagon load of supplies. New frames, proper foundation sheets, a full set of protective gear for each of them, and set it all in the equipment shed without comment. She examined each item, noted the quality, and said, Good. He nodded. They went to lunch, which that day was bread and cold beans because neither of them had thought about cooking, and they ate it standing up in the kitchen without particular embarrassment about the plainness of it. I'm going to Decker's Saturday, she said, to look at his available colonies. I'd like you to come. He looked up from his bread. Why? Because you're going to be working with these hives too, she said. Eventually, and because Decker will give me a better price if he thinks there's a serious operation behind the purchase, not just a woman showing up alone asking for nukes. He considered this. That's practical, he said. I'm a practical person, she said. She regretted the words slightly as soon as they were out. They felt like a summary of herself that wasn't entirely accurate and also wasn't something she'd meant to volunteer. But Garrick just nodded as though the statement was straightforward and required no further examination, which was, in its own way, a relief. The drive to Decker's was 32 miles on roads that were fine for the first 20, and then progressively less so, and they spent a good portion of it in the same comfortable quiet that had characterized their first wagon ride. Occasionally, she pointed something out, a stand of wildflowers she recognized as good forage, a pond that would factor into placement decisions. And he listened without asking questions that would have revealed he wasn't following, which meant he was following. Gerald Decker was a broad, slow-moving man in his 60s who operated out of a property that smelled overwhelmingly of beeswax and clover and the faint, persistent sweetness of honey that had saturated the very walls of his barn. He'd known her father. When Leora said Abel Ashcomb's name, something shifted in the old man's face. Genuine warmth, the kind that doesn't perform itself. Abel's girl, Decker said, looking at her carefully. I heard about the apiary. Damn shame. Your father knew more about bee behavior than anyone in this county. He paused. You take after him? He taught me everything he knew, she said. Then you're all right. He glanced at Garrick. This your operation? It's mine, Leora said before Garrick could answer. Decker looked at her, looked at Garrick, and made the quiet calculation of a man who had been paying attention to human beings long enough to read a situation accurately. Fair enough, he said. Come look at what I've got. She spent 2 hours at Decker's, going through his available nucleus colonies with the focused attention she gave to anything that mattered. She examined brood patterns, assessed queen quality, checked for signs of disease or poor temperament. Decker watched her work with the satisfied expression of a man watching someone perform a skill he respects. And when she straightened up from the 5th nuke box and said, "These 3 are good. These 2 need another month," he laughed outright. That's exactly what I'd have told you, he said. She bought 5 colonies, Chet's the 3 strong ones and the 2 that needed time, because she'd be back for them in 6 weeks and she wanted Decker to hold them. She negotiated the price down from what he quoted to something that accounted for the volume and the return business. And Garrick, standing slightly to the side throughout this exchange, said nothing and paid what she told him without visible objection. On the way home, with the secured note boxes in the back of the wagon and the road evening out as they came back into better country, he said, "You told him it was your operation." "It is," she said. "The bees are mine, my knowledge, my management, my responsibility." "It's my land," he said, not argumentatively, just noting the fact. "Yes," she said, "and when the orchard recovers, that'll be yours too. But what happens between those trees and what I put in the ground, that's mine to manage. If you're going to have a problem with that, we should discuss it now." He was quiet for a moment. The road ran between 2 low ridges, and the evening light was doing something warm and sideways across the hills. "No problem," he said. She let out a breath she'd been holding without knowing it. The hive placement took her 2 days to work out, and she was particular about it in a way that she didn't apologize for. Orientation mattered. South-facing entrances for the winter warmth, slight elevation to prevent flooding, windbreaks from the natural scrub on the property's north edge. She placed the first 3 colonies at the western end of the orchard, where the oldest trees stood because those were the ones most in need, and also the ones most likely to reward early attention. The other 2 went at intervals along the central row. The morning she installed the first colony, Garrick suited up without being asked. His veil wasn't quite right, sitting slightly off-center in a way that made him look faintly uncertain, and she straightened it without comment, her hands adjusting the frame with the impersonal efficiency of someone correcting a tool placement. He went still while she did it, which she noted because some men didn't like being corrected about physical things, even useful corrections. "Thank you," he said, when she stepped back. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "You haven't been through an installation." He hadn't. That was clear from the slight rigidity in his posture as she lit the smoker she'd repaired herself and which drew beautifully now, producing the cool white smoke that calmed bees by triggering a feeding response, overriding their defensive instincts. She showed him how to apply it, slow, deliberate, not too much. She showed him how to move around a hive, not fast, not jerky, not in ways that vibrated the boxes or threw sudden shadows over the entrance. She showed him that the goal was not to avoid the bees, but to communicate through your movements that you were not a threat. "They can feel the difference," she said, "between someone who's afraid and someone who's just paying attention." "How?" "Body chemistry, partly. Movement patterns. They're not stupid. They've been reading large animals for longer than large animals have been paying attention to them." She opened the nut box. "Look at the frames before you touch them. Learn to see what you're looking at. Brood here, those capped cells. Honey here. And there," she pointed, "the queen." He leaned in, closer than she expected, and looked at the frame with a concentration that surprised her. "How do you know which one she is?" "Longer abdomen. The workers orient around her without quite touching her. You see how they're moving in that small circle? They're attending to her." He watched for a long moment without speaking. Then, "Does she know she's the queen?" It was such an unexpected question that she actually stopped what she was doing for a second. "That's not a question I've ever thought about," she said honestly. "Forget it," he said. "That was a stupid thing to ask." "No," she said. "It wasn't." She transferred the first frame into the new hive box, her movement slow and certain. "My father would have liked that question." They worked through the morning in a kind of concentrated quiet that felt, by the end of it, like something they'd been doing together for longer than 4 days. Garrick was not a natural. He moved slightly too cautiously at first, overcompensating in the way beginners did, but he learned fast and he took correction without ego, which was rarer than it should have been. He got stung once, on the back of his left hand where his glove had gapped slightly. He made a small, involuntary sound, looked at his hand, and then looked at her. "You pull the stinger straight out. Don't squeeze it," she said. He did. His jaw was tight, but he didn't make another sound about it. "It'll swell," she said. "Not badly. Your first sting is always the worst reaction." "Good to know," he said, in the flat tone of someone declining to complain about something that clearly hurt. She almost smiled. Didn't quite. By the time the first week had turned into 3, a shape was emerging to their days that she hadn't expected and didn't examine too closely. She rose early and walked the orchard. He was usually already up, working on the 1,000 small maintenance tasks that a property accumulates: fencing, irrigation channels, the perpetual war against encroaching scrub. They crossed paths throughout the day without making a formal arrangement of it. In the evenings after supper, which they'd fallen into the habit of eating together because cooking for one when 2 people needed to eat was inefficient, they sometimes sat on the porch and talked, or didn't. The talking, when it happened, was gradual and careful. The way conversation is between people who've both recently been hurt by things they haven't fully processed. She told him about her father, about the apiary, about the specific grief of watching something you love be taken for reasons that have nothing to do with its value. He listened in the way she was coming to understand was characteristic of him, fully, without interjecting, without redirecting toward his own experience. He didn't tell her about Caroline, not directly, but sometimes he'd reference something. A preference about the house, a habit, the way he'd arranged the kitchen, and she'd understand from context that he was navigating the accumulated evidence of a life he'd shared with someone who was gone. She didn't push. She knew what it was like to live alongside an absence. The talk from town arrived about 10 days in, carried by Elsa Holt with the straightforward honesty of a woman who believed that warning someone about gossip was more respectful than pretending it didn't exist. "They're saying you ran away," Elsa said, on one of her not necessarily Tuesday visits. She was helping Leora patch the bunkhouse roof, handing up shingles with the competent ease of someone who'd fixed her own roof plenty of times. "That you're hiding out here because you couldn't face anyone after what happened." "That's one way to look at it," Leora said, nailing down a shingle with perhaps slightly more force than strictly necessary. "They're also saying worse things," Elsa said, "about why a woman would come to live on a single man's property." The nail went in. Leora reached for another shingle. "Let them," she said. "It doesn't bother you?" She thought about this for a moment, sitting back on her heels on the roof slope. The orchard was visible from up here, all of it. The full sweep of struggling trees and the small dark rectangles of the new hive boxes at the western end, already humming with the beginning of activity that she could feel in her chest even from this distance. "It bothers me," she said. "Of course it does. I've known some of those people my whole life." She looked at Elsa. "But I'm not going to leave an orchard that needs my work because some people in Crestfield have decided I should be ashamed of surviving something that wasn't my fault." Elsa studied her for a moment. "Your father would have liked you," she said. "He did," Leora said. "When he remembered to show it." She handed back the hammer. One more row. The spring blossom came 6 weeks after the first installation, and it was the first real test of what she'd set in motion. She was up at first light to watch it, standing at the edge of the orchard in the cool early morning, the air carrying the smell of apple blossom so strong it was almost a physical thing, watching the hives. For a long time there was nothing remarkable. The light strengthened, the blossoms opened in the warmth, and then, gradually, she began to hear it, the sound she'd been listening for without letting herself consciously listen for it, because hoping for things had recently taught her to be careful. The hum. Not loud, not dramatic, just the low, purposeful vibration of bees going to work. The same sound she'd grown up with. The sound that to her meant not just industry, but a kind of rightness. Things operating the way they were supposed to operate. The ancient negotiation between flower and bee playing out the way it had always played out. She stood there in the early light and listened to it. She didn't hear Garrett come up beside her, but she wasn't startled when he was suddenly there. He moved quietly, and she'd gotten used to his presence without needing to track it. They stood together without speaking for a while, watching the bees move through the blossom-heavy branches. "It's working," he said finally. Quietly, like saying it too loud might break something. "It's starting," she said. "There's a difference." "Right." He was quiet again. Then, "How long did you know this was going to work?" She considered the honest answer. "Pretty much from the first day I walked the orchard," she said. "The trees aren't sick, they're just isolated, missing a conversation partner." She paused. "I knew it would work if I could give them back what they were missing." "You didn't say that. I didn't want to promise something I hadn't delivered yet. He looked at her sideways, briefly. My father used to say that people who know things but won't say them until they're sure are the only people worth listening to. She didn't respond to that directly, because it landed somewhere in her chest in a way she wasn't ready to examine. Instead, she watched a single bee work its way along a branch, moving from blossom to blossom with the efficient, unhurried attention of something that understood exactly what it was doing and had no energy to waste on anything else. That was the thing about bees, she thought. They didn't perform their purpose. They didn't need acknowledgement for it. They simply did the work because the work was necessary, because the relationship between what they needed and what the flowers needed had been worked out between them long before anyone was watching. She thought about the woman she'd been 2 months ago, standing at an altar, waiting for a man who'd already made his choice, in a dress that fit perfectly and meant nothing. She thought about the woman standing here now, in borrowed clothes and her own shoes, listening to a sound she understood better than anything else in the world. The distance between those two women was not long in time, but it was substantial in every way that mattered. The bees worked on, indifferent to her thoughts, which was exactly as it should be. The first harvest came in August, and it was not a miracle. Leora wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. People would later remember it as something almost supernatural, the failing orchard that had suddenly exploded into abundance. But the reality was more complicated and less romantic than the story would eventually become. The fruit set was improved, noticeably, in the sections of the orchard nearest the hives. The apples in the western rows were heavier and more uniform than anything Garrick had pulled from those trees in years. But the eastern end was still struggling, the 2 nuke colonies she'd placed there in late spring not yet strong enough to work the full canopy. And there were trees that bore almost nothing, older ones, stressed in ways that would take more than one good season to undo. She told Garrick all of this while they were picking side by side in the early morning before the heat built, hauling full crates to the wagon at the end of each row. He listened to her honest accounting without trying to reframe it into something more triumphant. "It's better," he said. "It's better," she agreed. "It's not fixed." "How many more seasons?" 2, maybe 3 for the full orchard. If we expand the hive count this winter, I want to go to 12 colonies by spring. And if I can get those eastern trees properly supplemented, we should see something closer to the orchard's actual capacity by year 3. He hoisted a full crate onto the wagon with the particular movement of a man who'd been doing physical labor long enough that he'd stopped noticing it. "Year 3, he said, flat, not objecting, just absorbing. "You asked," she said. "I did." He picked up another empty crate. "What's the orchard's actual capacity? If everything's working right?" She'd thought about this. She'd looked at the tree density, the soil, the slope, the water retention, the total acreage. She'd done the math twice. "More than you've produced in the past 5 years combined," she said, "possibly more than your father ever produced." He stopped walking for a moment. Not long, just a pause in which she could see him processing the size of what she'd just said. Then he picked up the crate and kept moving. "All right," he said, 12 colonies. That was the thing about working with Garrick Rowan. She was slowly learning. He didn't perform reactions to information. Good news or bad news arrived, and he absorbed it and adjusted and moved forward. She'd grown up around her father, who was similar, a man of practical processing rather than emotional announcement. And she found this quality in Garrick settling in a way she hadn't anticipated. After Edmund, who had been all performed confidence and surface warmth, there was something deeply reassuring about a man whose internal weather and external presentation matched. She didn't examine that thought too carefully. She had enough to manage. The harvest brought visitors, buyers from the market town of Alderley, 20 miles east, who arrived to look at what Garrick Rowan's orchard was producing and came away with more than they'd expected to purchase. Word traveled the way word does in country, where everyone knows everyone's business, and the arrival of a better apple is genuinely notable. By the end of August, 2 merchants had placed advance orders for the following year's crop at prices Garrick had never been offered before. Elsa was on the porch when the second merchant drove away, and she sat with Leora in the cooling afternoon and said, without preamble, "People are starting to ask about the beekeeper." Leora glanced at her. "What kind of asking?" "The curious kind, mostly. Some of it respectful." Elsa paused. "And some of it is Constance Voss." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Leora kept her face even. "What about her?" Constance Voss was Edmund's mother, a woman Leora had met perhaps a dozen times during the courtship, always in the context of dinners or planning meetings in which Constance had managed to be simultaneously generous and controlling, the kind of hostess who made you feel welcomed and assessed in the same breath. She was a prominent figure in Crestfield, which was to say she was a woman with opinions and the social position to ensure those opinions circulated. "She's telling people," Elsa said carefully, "that you came out here because Garrick Rowan had money and you needed somewhere to land after Edmund left." The flatness of it, the specific shape of the cruelty, how precisely it was aimed, sat in Leora's chest for a moment before she answered. "That's almost true," she said, "except for the money part, which is laughable, and the part where I actually do something useful instead of just sitting here." "I know that," Elsa said. "Most people with sense know it. But Constance has a particular talent for making sure her son's decisions don't look like his fault," Leora said. "Yes, I noticed that during the engagement." Elsa looked at her with the expression of someone reassessing an estimate upward. "You don't say much about him." "There's not much to say." Leora set down the cup she'd been holding. "He was afraid of something. I still don't know exactly what. Maybe he realized he didn't actually want to marry me. Maybe he found a better opportunity. Maybe he just panicked and ran. The note he left had exactly one feeling in it, and that feeling was relief that he didn't have to explain himself to my face." She paused. "What I think about, mostly, isn't Edmund. It's that I was willing to marry someone I didn't love because I was scared. That's the part that bothers me." Elsa was quiet for a moment. "You were 24 and homeless and your father had just died," she said. "That's not weakness. That's arithmetic." "Maybe," Leora said, "but I knew. I knew the morning of the wedding, standing in front of that mirror, and I walked up the aisle anyway." "And he's the one who walked away," Elsa said. "Not you." It was a distinction Leora had been slowly learning to hold on to, in the small hours of the night when the bunkhouse was quiet and her mind went looking for things to gnaw on. She had not run. She had not broken her own promise. Whatever had been insufficient about that situation, it had not been her commitment or her honesty. She was still working out what to do with that. The second season, the following year, the full cycle from winter preparation through spring blossom through harvest, was when things began to genuinely shift. She expanded to 12 colonies over the winter as planned, sourcing 4 more from Decker and establishing 2 new ones from splits she took from her strongest hives in late March. The splitting process required a kind of focused nerve that she'd learned young, finding the old queen, separating her into a new box, trusting the remaining colony to raise a new queen from the eggs she'd left behind. There was always a period of several weeks where the split colony was without a mated queen and the whole enterprise felt precarious, like a conversation where you'd said something irreversible and were waiting to see how it landed. Garrick watched her work a split one afternoon in early April, suited up and standing at the angle she'd taught him, not directly in the flight path, not casting a shadow over the entrance. And when she'd finished and stepped back, he said, "How do you know they'll raise a new queen? What if they don't?" "They will," she said. "They have everything they need, fertilized eggs, nurse bees, the instinct to do it. They've been raising queens longer than anyone has been watching them do it." "But what if something goes wrong?" "Then I intervene," she said. "I introduce a mated queen from another source, but I give them the chance to manage it themselves first, because they usually do better when they're not being managed too tightly." She pulled off her gloves. "The worst thing you can do with bees is open the hive too often. They need time to work without someone second-guessing them." He was quiet for a moment in that way he had, where she'd learned to tell the difference between him having nothing to say and him having something he was deciding whether to say. "That sounds like good advice for more than bees," he said finally. "My father said it was good advice for most things," she said. He was probably right. The spring blossom that second year was different in a way that was difficult to articulate but immediately apparent to anyone paying attention. The sound was the first thing. The hum from the orchard was audible from the farmhouse now, a persistent undertone to the mornings that Garrick told her, one breakfast, he'd started listening for specifically. The blossom itself was heavier, the trees putting out more than they had the year before, as though they were responding to the knowledge that the conversation they'd been missing had been restored. She caught him, once, standing in the middle of a row with his head slightly tilted, just listening. He didn't notice her noticing, and she didn't say anything about it. The fruit that summer confirmed what the blossom had promised. The apple set was dense and even across 2/3 of the orchard. The eastern end was still behind, still catching up, but it was catching up visibly now, which was different from the year before. The pear trees, which had been the most severely affected, and which she'd been quietly most worried about, produced a crop that had Garrick standing in the middle of the pear row on a Tuesday morning in July with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not quite wonder. Something more private than that. My father used to say these pear trees were the best on the frontier, he said. I thought he was being sentimental. He wasn't, Leora said, looking at the loaded branches. These are old trees. They know what they're doing. He reached up and pressed his hand against the bark of the nearest trunk. An unconscious gesture, the kind people make when they want to confirm something is real. She looked away because it felt private. The merchants came back in numbers that August, and they brought others. The advance orders for the following year doubled what they'd been. A buyer from a hotel in the regional capital, a man named Price, who arrived in a coat that was wrong for the country but spoke knowledgeably about fruit quality, made an offer for the entire pear crop 2 years forward that made Garrick go very still for several seconds. You'll need to talk to my orchard manager, Garrick said, which was the first time he'd used that phrase, and Leora, standing 3 feet away, felt it register somewhere in her chest in a way she noted and then set aside. Price turned to her. He was a brisk, assessing man who clearly hadn't expected the orchard manager to be a young woman in work clothes with dirt under her fingernails and a bee sting swelling on her left wrist from that morning's inspection. He recalibrated visibly. Not rudely, but noticeably. Miss, Ashcombe, she said. Leora Ashcombe. The beekeeper, he said, and something in his tone shifted to a cautious respect that she recognized as the kind men produced when they'd underestimated something and been surprised. I've heard your name. Have you? She said. It wasn't quite a question. From Decker, mostly. He says you're the best he's seen since your father. Price glanced at the orchard around them, at the loaded trees and the faint audible hum from the hive yard. Looking at this, I'd say his assessment was generous, but not wrong. She named a price for the forward contract that was higher than what Price had offered. There was a pause. That's aggressive, Price said. That's accurate, she said. You've seen the fruit. You know the quality. You're not making this trip and this offer because you found something ordinary. Another pause. Price looked at Garrick, who looked back at him with the steady, unreadable expression he deployed when he was, in fact, waiting to see what happened. Agreed, Price said. He put his hand out. She shook it. After Price left, Garrick was quiet for a long time. Through the walk back to the farmhouse, through the washing up, through most of supper. She'd learned not to crowd his silences. They were usually productive. Finally, he said, Constance Voss came into Alderley Market last week. She looked up. And? She told the Merkel brothers, they run the grain exchange, that this place was getting too big for what it was. He looked at his hands. She said that a woman who'd been thrown over at the altar had no business running a serious orchard operation. The grain exchanged slow, uncomfortable. What did the Merkel brothers say? They told her they'd just bought a forward contract on Rowan Orchard apples at the best price they'd seen in 5 years. A pause. And that they didn't much care who the orchard manager was, as long as the fruit was what it was. She looked at him. There was something in his face, something he was containing, that she thought might be satisfaction, except that Garrick Rowan contained his satisfaction so thoroughly that they rarely achieved expression. Good, she said. Constance wasn't finished, he said. She said... He stopped, looked at her. It doesn't matter what she said. Tell me. He was quiet for a moment. She said you had designs on the property, that you'd positioned yourself here deliberately, that the whole thing was calculated. The words sat between them on the kitchen table. Leora picked up her fork, put it down again, and thought about Constance Voss, about a woman whose son had written inconvenience in a note left for the woman he'd promised to marry, and who had apparently decided that the best use of her considerable energy was to make sure the wrong person felt the shame of that. Garrick, she said. Yeah. I need you to know something. He looked at her and his face was very careful. The face of someone who understood that what came next was important and was not going to interrupt it. "I came here because I had nowhere to go," she said. "That's the truth. You asked me a question and I answered it, and you made a fair offer. And I took it because I didn't have options." She held his gaze. "What I've built here, what I've done with this orchard, that's real work. That's my father's knowledge and my own labor and 4 years of getting up before sunrise and caring about something because it deserves to be cared about, not because of this property, not because of you." She paused. "I need you to know the difference." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the last of the day was fading from the sky, and the orchard had gone still and dark in the way it did at the end of a long summer day, and she could just barely, if she was listening for it, hear the low settling sound of the hives going quiet. "I know the difference," Garrick said. His voice was even, but there was something under it, something careful and held. "Good," she said. "Then Constance Voss can say whatever she likes." He nodded slowly. "She's going to keep talking." "People like her always do," Leora said. "But you can only be damaged by a lie if you let it define the conversation. I don't intend to." She picked her fork back up. He picked his up. They finished supper. Later, much later, when she was back in the bunkhouse and the night had fully settled, she lay awake and thought about what she'd said, and what he'd said, and the space between them in the kitchen where something had almost happened and then hadn't. She wasn't naive enough to pretend she didn't feel it. She wasn't reckless enough to let herself build anything on it. There were too many reasons. The arrangement between them, the careful balance of respect and practicality they'd established, his quiet, ongoing grief for Caroline, her own raw and recent wound, to allow herself to follow that thread anywhere. She turned over on the narrow bunk and stared at the wall and told herself to be patient, that she'd spent 2 years learning to read bees, to understand that good timing was everything, that what you wanted and what you were ready for were not always the same thing, that some things needed to develop in their own time. Outside, the third season was already beginning to gather itself. In the strengthening colonies, in the improving soil, in the deep-rooted trees that were slowly remembering their capacity. The orchard did not know about Edmund Voss or Constance Voss's opinions, or the careful geography of distance Leora maintained between herself and the one person she'd come to trust entirely. It just kept working, the way living things do, with the dogged, undramatic persistence of something that has decided to keep going. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would check the eastern colonies. She wanted to see how the new queens were laying. She wanted to see if the brood pattern on Hive 7 had improved the way she suspected it had. There was always, she'd found, something to go back for. The Harvest Festival was Crestfield's largest annual event, and in the 3rd year of Leora's work at Rowan Orchard, it was also the first year anyone suggested the orchard should have a proper stall. It was Elsa's idea, which meant it arrived not as a suggestion, but as a fait accompli. Elsa had already spoken to the festival committee, already reserved a corner spot near the main lane where the foot traffic was best, and arrived at the farmhouse on a Wednesday morning in late September to inform them of these facts with the cheerful authority of someone who has already made a decision on your behalf and is confident you'll be grateful. "You have the best fruit in the county," she said, setting a pot of coffee on the table without being asked. "People should see where it comes from. And the honey. Leora, you have 7 varieties now. You should be selling that honey." Leora looked at Garrick. Garrick looked at his coffee. "She's not wrong," he said. "I know she's not wrong," Leora said. She stopped. The honest version of the sentence was, "I haven't been back to Crestfield since I walked out of that church." She hadn't said it out loud to either of them, but she suspected they both knew it. She'd found reasons to stay on the property or go to Alderley or Decker's when supplies were needed. Crestfield was 18 miles west, and she had been managing the distance with the same quiet deliberateness she applied to everything else. "It's been 3 years, Elsa said. Not unkindly, just factually. I know how long it's been. Then you know that most of those people have moved on to worrying about other things, a drought, a wedding, someone else's disaster." Elsa poured herself coffee and sat down. "You walking into that festival with the best orchard honey anyone's tasted in 20 years is not going to feel like what you're afraid it's going to feel like." "I'm not afraid," Leora said. Elsa and Garrick both looked at her. "I'm cautious," she said. "There's a difference." "There is?" Garrick said. But in this case, the outcome is the same. He set down his cup. I'll be there. Elsa will be there. The fruit will speak for itself. He paused. You don't have to hide from those people, Leora. You never did. It was the most direct thing he'd said to her in months. Not about the orchard, not about logistics, but about her. About the specific shape of what she was carrying. She looked at him across the table and found that his face was doing the thing it rarely did, where the careful composure dropped slightly and what was underneath it was visible for a moment. Something that was neither pity nor detachment, but something more genuine than either. Fine, she said, but I'm pricing the honey high enough that Constance Voss can't afford it. Elsa laughed so hard she nearly knocked over her coffee. They spent the week before the festival preparing the stall display. Leora's 7 honey varieties, the orchard apples in their best presentation, a small arrangement of honeycomb that Elsa insisted on, and which turned out to be the right call aesthetically. Leora labeled each honey jar in her own handwriting, which was small and precise, and her father's handwriting looked back at her from it every time, which she found she could handle now without the same sharp grief she'd carried in the early years. The morning of the festival, she was up at 4 to check the hives, habit, and also the productive displacement of nervous energy, and came back to find Garrick already loading the wagon in the gray pre-dawn dark. He'd stacked the crates with more care than was strictly necessary, which told her he was also not entirely unaware of the significance of the day. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her. Neither of them said anything about it being the first time she'd ridden toward Crestfield since the ride away from it, 3 years ago, in the opposite direction, in a dress that was turning gray with dust. Some things didn't need to be said. She'd learned that from him, among other things. The festival was already moving by the time they arrived and set up, the main lane filling with stalls and early visitors, the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread and livestock drifting through the October air. Crestfield looked the way frontier towns looked when they were trying their best. Scrubbed up, decorated with what people had, loud with the particular energy of people who had been working hard for months and were finally allowed to stop for a day. Nobody said anything strange to her. That was the first thing she noticed. A few people looked at her with the careful recognition of individuals assembling a memory. Ashcombe girl, wasn't she? Something about a wedding. But most of them were absorbed in the festival, in their children, in arguing with neighboring stall holders about placement in the 1,000 small concerns of a community day. An old woman named Mrs. Farley, who had sat 3 pews behind Leora in the church on the morning of June 14th, 3 years ago, stopped at their stall and picked up a jar of the clover honey and turned it in her hands and said, "This from Rowan Orchard?" And when Leora said yes, she said, "I'll take 2," and paid without any further commentary whatsoever, which was, Leora thought, exactly the kind of grace that ordinary people were sometimes capable of without making a performance of it. By mid-morning, 4 of the 7 honey varieties had sold out. The apple display was drawing a steady crowd. Garrick was handling the cider orders with the particular efficient calm that characterized him in any situation requiring organization, and Elsa had appointed herself ambassador to every neighboring stall and was conducting trade negotiations with 3 different preserve sellers simultaneously. Leora was explaining to a young woman the difference between wildflower and orchard blossom honey. The orchard honey was lighter, she was saying, with a particular floral note that came specifically from pear blossom, which was rarer than people realized, when she felt something change in the crowd. Not a sound, not a visible disturbance, just a shift, the way a hive shifts, a collective subtle change in frequency, that her body registered before her brain caught up. She looked up. Edmund Voss was standing at the entrance to the main lane. He was thinner than she remembered, and something about his posture had changed. The easy, confident looseness she'd associated with him was gone, replaced by a kind of held-together quality, like a man managing a presentation of himself that required effort. He was dressed well, too well for the festival, in a coat that was alderly rather than Crestfield, and he was scanning the stalls with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Then he found her. She watched him locate her across the crowd and watched his expression do something complicated, recognition, then something that might have been calculation, then something else she couldn't name. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds and then turned back to the young woman and finished her explanation about the honey. "The orchard blossom is the one I'd recommend," she said. "It's particular to this property. You won't find it anywhere else. The young woman bought 2 jars. Leora wrapped them carefully and handed them over and said, "Thank you." And when she looked up again, Edmund was closer, 20 feet away, moving through the crowd toward the stall with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided something and is committed to it. Elsa appeared at Leora's elbow from nowhere, which was a talent Elsa had. "That's—" Elsa began. "Yes," Leora said. "Do you want me to—" "No," Leora said. "Thank you." She straightened up behind the stall table and waited. Around them the festival continued, children running, someone's dog investigating a bread stall with criminal intent, the sound of a fiddle starting up somewhere near the square. She was aware that Garrick, at the far end of the stall, had gone still in the particular way that meant he'd noticed and was paying attention without making it obvious. Edmund stopped in front of the stall. Up close, the thinness was more apparent, not sickness, but the specific look of a man who had been under sustained pressure for long enough that it had started to show in his face. His eyes moved across the stall, the honey jars, the apple display, the small, tasteful sign that read Rowan Orchard Established, and something moved through his expression that she thought might have been surprise. "Leora," he said. "Edmund," she said. A pause. He seemed to be assembling something. Words, approach, some version of the conversation he'd rehearsed on the way here. She waited, because she had time, and he apparently didn't. "This is—" He gestured at the stall, at the orchard display. "This is impressive. I'd heard, but I didn't—" He stopped, restarted. "You've done well for yourself." "I've done good work," she said. "That's different from doing well for myself." He blinked. He hadn't expected that. She could see him recalibrating. "I came because I wanted to talk to you," he said, lowering his voice slightly as though the conversation could be made private in the middle of a crowded festival lane. "I know I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "An apology you're delivering 3 years late because your circumstances changed isn't a debt being paid. It's housekeeping." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not fair." "Edmund." She kept her voice even, not cold, but very clear. "What happened to your trading business?" The shift in his face was immediate and involuntary. I heard it collapsed," she said. "I heard there were some contract disputes in Alderley that went badly. I heard you've been looking for a fresh start." She paused. "I heard your mother told anyone who would listen that you'd made a mistake leaving Crestfield." The fiddle somewhere in the square had picked up tempo, and the crowd around them moved and flowed, and Edmund Voss stood in front of a stall covered in evidence of everything he'd walked away from and looked like a man who had arrived with a script that was no longer usable. "I made a mistake," he said. And she could hear, she was almost certain she could hear, that some part of it was genuine, that he was not entirely performing this. I panicked. The morning of the wedding, I panicked, and I couldn't—" He exhaled. "I'm not making excuses." "You are," she said, "but I believe you believe their reasons." "Leora, I'm going to say something to you, and I need you to actually hear it." She looked at him directly, not with anger, which would have given him too much, but with the clear, frank steadiness she'd developed over 3 years of working alongside something that required her honest attention. "You leaving was the worst day of my life. Standing in that church, reading that note, walking out in front of everyone, it was the worst thing that had happened to me since my father died. And for a while it felt worse than that." She paused. "And it was also the thing that brought me here, to this work, to the only life I've ever built entirely on my own terms." She looked at the stall, at the honey jars in their rows, at the apple crates, and the small crowd of people still drifting over to look. "So I'm not going to thank you because that would be absurd. But I'm also not going to let you stand there feeling like the wound you made is still bleeding, because it isn't." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. "You've changed," he said. "I've become more accurately myself," she said. "That's not the same as changing." He looked at her, and whatever he'd come here expecting to find, whatever version of Leora Ashcombe he'd constructed in his memory over 3 years, she could see him registering that it bore very little resemblance to the woman in front of him. She was in work clothes. Her hands had the particular calloused quality that came from real labor. She was standing in a festival stall she'd built and filled with products she'd created from a knowledge she'd earned, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not hostile but was completely, utterly unbothered. He opened his mouth. "Go home, Edmund," she said. Not meanly, just finished. He went. She watched him turn and move back through the crowd, and then she turned back to the stall, and Elsa handed her a cup of cider from somewhere without comment, which was exactly right. It was Garrick who spoke, after the next customer had come and gone, and the crowd had thinned slightly around them in the early afternoon lull. "You all right?" he said. Simple, direct, no decoration on it. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it completely. Not as a performance of composure, not as the refusal to admit weakness that she'd sometimes confused for strength in herself, but as a plain, accurate statement of fact. She was all right. The meeting she'd been unconsciously dreading for 3 years had arrived and passed, and the ground under her feet was exactly where she'd left it. "What did he want?" Garrick asked. "To feel like he hadn't ruined something irreplaceable," she said. "And?" "I told him he hadn't." She picked up the next honey jar that needed relabeling and looked at it. "Because he didn't. He just redirected it." Garrick was quiet for a moment. "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "I'm not feeling generous toward Edmund Voss. I'm feeling accurate." She set the jar down. "There's a difference." He looked at her with an expression that she'd cataloged by now, the one where something was happening behind his eyes that his face was declining to fully announce. She'd spent 3 years learning the map of him the way she'd learned the map of the orchard. Not by being told, but by paying attention over time, by noticing what was there and what was missing and what was growing slowly in the in-between. "He's an idiot," Garrick said. It was the most uncharacteristic thing he'd said in their entire acquaintance, and it startled a laugh out of her, a real one, sudden and undignified, the kind she hadn't produced in public in longer than she could remember. He looked faintly surprised at himself. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "He is," she said, when she could. "But he's someone else's problem now." The festival wound down in the long golden light of an October afternoon, and by the time they were loading the empty crates back onto the wagon, the honey was entirely sold out, and they'd taken orders for the following spring's crop from 4 buyers Garrick had never dealt with before. Elsa had exchanged business arrangements with approximately everyone in Crestfield and was deeply satisfied with herself. The fiddle player in the square had graduated to a full small band, and the last of the evening crowd was still drifting between stalls in the particular relaxed way of people who had spent a good day outdoors. Leora climbed up onto the wagon seat. Garrick climbed up beside her and picked up the reins, and they drove out of Crestfield in the fading light. And the road that stretched ahead of them was the same road she'd come in on, the same road she'd walked out on 3 years ago in a ruined dress with a folded note in her hand and nowhere to go. It looked entirely different now, not because the road had changed. Roads didn't change. She had. The ride home from the festival was quiet in the way that good things sometimes are, not empty, but full of something that didn't need words to exist. Leora watched the road unreal in the last of the October light, and thought about Edmund's face when he'd walked away. Not with satisfaction, exactly. Satisfaction implied she'd been waiting for that moment, and she hadn't been, not consciously. But there was something that had settled in her chest during that conversation, something that had been slightly loose for 3 years and had finally found its position, like a hive frame seated properly in the box after you'd been running it slightly crooked without realizing it. She hadn't needed to destroy him. She hadn't needed to perform her anger for the crowd or make a scene that people would repeat in detail for years. She'd just told him the truth in plain language and watched him understand it, and that had been enough. More than enough. It turned out that the thing she'd feared most about seeing him again, the collapse, the humiliation retrieved and re-experienced, hadn't arrived. What had arrived instead was something closer to clarity, the recognition that the woman who had stood in that church waiting for him bore almost no resemblance to the woman who had told him, quietly and without ceremony, to go home. Garrick drove without comment, which was one of the things she had come to trust about him most. He didn't fill silences he hadn't been invited into. They were 4 miles from the orchard when she said, "Thank you for today." He glanced at her. "I didn't do anything." "You were there," she said. "That was something." He looked back at the road. "It wasn't enough earlier. With Edmund. I wanted to... He stopped. I know, she said, but I needed to handle it myself. I know that too, he said. Doesn't mean the wanting wasn't there. She let that sit between them without answering it, because it didn't need an answer. It needed acknowledgement, which was different, and she gave it that by not deflecting it away. The orchard appeared around the curve of the low hill, the same way it always did. First the dark shapes of the older trees against the fading sky. Then the full sweep of the rows, then the faint sound, even at this hour, of the hives settling into their evening quiet. She'd learned in her first winter here that bees don't go entirely silent even at night. There was always a low, warm hum from a healthy hive, the sound of 50,000 small bodies maintaining the temperature of the brood nest, keeping the colony alive through the cold. She'd started sleeping with the bunkhouse window cracked just enough to hear it. It had become, without her planning for it, the sound she fell asleep to. They unloaded the wagon in the near dark, working by the light from the farmhouse window, and it was comfortable work, the kind that two people do after years of learning each other's rhythms, where you hand something across before it's asked for and step aside before someone has to say, "Excuse me." She'd noticed this quality of their working relationship before, but never named it to herself, because naming things sometimes made them self-conscious, and she hadn't wanted to disturb it. Elsa had gone home after the festival with the satisfied bearing of someone who had accomplished several things simultaneously, and so the farmhouse was empty when they came inside, and Leora put the kettle on while Garrick sat down at the kitchen table with the day's accounts and worked through them in the quiet way he had with numbers. Methodical, not fast, but accurate. Net on the honey alone was better than the whole festival stall last year, he said without looking up. I know, she said. We should double the honey production for next season. There's capacity in the current colonies if I manage the splits right, and I want to add 2 more hives on the eastern property line where the wildflower growth is strongest. All right. It'll mean more of my time on the honey side and less on the orchard maintenance through summer. You'll need to take on more of the hive inspections. He looked up at that. You trust me to do inspections alone? You've been doing assisted inspections for 2 years, she said. You know what you're looking at. You know when something's wrong. She poured the tea and set his cup down beside the account ledger. Yes, I trust you. He looked at her, held her gaze for a moment in that way he had where you felt seen without feeling examined, and then nodded. Okay, he said. It was not a large moment, but it was real, and they both knew it. The winter that followed was the hardest one in several years. Not devastatingly so, not the kind of winter that broke people, but the sustained grinding cold that set in by November and didn't release its grip until late March, turning the ground iron hard and keeping everyone closer to home than they wanted to be. Leora winterized the hives in October, wrapping them against the wind, reducing the entrances, confirming each colony had sufficient honey stores to last the cold months. She lost 1 hive in February to what she believed was a queen failure that had gone unnoticed in the late-season inspections. The colony had dwindled too far to sustain itself through the cold. She found them on a Tuesday morning, a cluster of bees too small to hold their heat, and she stood in front of the open hive in the gray February air and felt the specific quiet sadness of losing something that had been under her care. She told Garrick that evening. I missed it, she said. The queen must have been failing since October, and I didn't catch it in time. He was quiet for a moment. You check those hives every week. Not well enough, apparently. Leora. He said her name in the tone he used when he thought she was being unfair to herself. You manage 14 colonies. You lost 1 in the worst winter in 6 years. It was my job to catch it, she said. Not defensively, just flatly, the way she held herself to things. Yeah, he said, and next season you will. She looked at him. You don't know that. No, he said, but you do, and you will. She didn't argue further because he wasn't wrong. She sat with the loss, because she believed in sitting with losses rather than explaining them away. And then she moved forward, the way the work required. Spring came back the way it always did, indifferent to the winter that had preceded it, and with it the particular restlessness that Leora had come to associate with the season. The hives building up their populations, the trees putting out the first tentative bud growth, the whole property waking up from its cold months' dormancy with an energy that was almost audible. She felt it in herself too, every spring, a kind of readiness that was partly the beekeeper's anticipation of the season's work and partly something she'd stopped trying to name precisely. It was in this fourth spring, in late April, that Garrick came out to the hive yard where she was doing the first full inspection of the season and stood at the edge of the cleared ground and watched her work for a while without speaking. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him when he was near, a steady peripheral presence that she'd long since stopped pretending she didn't notice. She finished the frame she was examining, replaced it carefully, closed the hive, and turned around. He had his hands in his pockets, which was the posture he adopted when he was working out how to say something. "There's something I want to say to you," he said. She pulled off her gloves. "All right." He was quiet for a moment, not the comfortable working quiet she knew, but a different kind, the kind that had weight in it. "I've been working out how to say this for a while," he said, "and I'm not good at this kind of thing, so I'm just going to say it plainly." "That's usually best," she said. He looked at her. "When I found you on that road 3 years ago, I thought I was solving a practical problem. 2 problems, actually, yours and mine. And I told myself that was what it was. For a long time I told myself that." He paused. "And then somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to tell myself that. And I didn't do anything about it, because you were—" He stopped, restarted. "You were building something, you were becoming something, and it wasn't my place to get in the way of that." She stood very still. "I watched you handle Edmund yesterday," he said. "I watched you stand there and say exactly what needed to be said, and not one word more, and I thought—" His jaw moved slightly. "I thought, there she is. That's who she is now, and she doesn't need me to rescue her or provide for her, or—" He exhaled. "She doesn't need anything from me except maybe what I actually want to offer her, which is just myself. Whatever that's worth." The hive yard was quiet around them. 14 hives, all healthy now, all working. The apple trees at the near end of the orchard were in full blossom, the smell of it heavy in the morning air, and the sound, that particular low persistent hum she'd been rebuilding for 3 years, was everywhere at once. "Garrick," she said. "I'm not finished," he said. "I need to say this whole thing or I'll lose my nerve." She almost smiled. "Sorry, go ahead. Caroline was—" He stopped, looked at the ground for a moment. "She was a good person, and I loved her, and losing her was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And for a long time after that, I thought the orchard dying was what I deserved, like I wasn't taking care of it, and it was going to go because that was appropriate, because things were supposed to go." He looked up. "And then you showed up and started arguing with my orchard and winning, and something in me that had been deciding to quit started changing its mind." He paused. "I know that probably sounds like I'm grateful. I'm not saying this because I'm grateful." "What are you saying?" she asked, quietly. "I'm saying I love you," he said. "Not because you saved the orchard, not because you're useful or capable or any of those things, though you are all of those things, because you're you. Because you ask the right questions and don't need to be managed, and you told Gerald Decker the bees were yours with complete calm because they were yours, and you told Edmund Voss to go home like it was the simplest thing in the world." He looked at her steadily, and the careful composure she'd spent 3 years learning to read was fully open now, nothing held back. "Because I've been paying attention to you for 4 years, and everything I've noticed has made me more certain than the thing before it." She looked at him for a long time. Here was the thing she'd been honest with herself about, in pieces, over the last 2 years. In the bunkhouse at night, in the quiet of the hive yard in the mornings, in the kitchen across the table when he said something that landed somewhere she wasn't expecting. She had not let herself want this. Not because she didn't feel it, because she'd been so thoroughly dismantled by the last time she'd organized her future around another person that she'd quietly, carefully, placed everything she valued in her own hands and kept it there. Work, knowledge, purpose, self. She'd built something real and solid and entirely hers, and she'd been not afraid of Garrick exactly, but careful of him. Careful of the feeling. Careful of what it meant to trust the shape of someone's character after you'd been wrong about it once. But she had not been wrong about Garrick Rowan. She'd known that for a while, and the knowing had been so steady and so quiet that she'd almost been able to pretend it was something else. "I have some things to say back," she said. "Okay," he said. When you asked me if I had anywhere to go on that road, I thought you wanted something, she said. I spent the first 2 weeks here trying to work out what it was, what you expected, what the real terms of the arrangement were. She looked at him. And slowly I realized there weren't hidden terms, that you just meant what you said. And that was so foreign to me at that point that I didn't know what to do with it. He was listening the way he always listened, completely. I'm not the same person who sat in the road in that dress, she said. I think you know that. And the person I am now doesn't need to be with anyone. I want you to understand that distinction. I do, he said. I'm counting on it. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means I don't want someone who needs me, he said. I've thought about this a lot. A person who stays because they need somewhere to stay is a person who leaves when they don't. I want someone who stays because, he paused, because the staying is what they actually want. She held his gaze, and what she felt was not the relief she'd felt when she accepted Edmund's proposal, that shallow, slightly desperate relief of a problem solved. What she felt was something more complicated and more solid than that, something that had been building at the same slow pace as the orchard recovery, quietly and without announcement, in the accumulated weight of 4 years of honest days. Ask me properly, she said. He blinked. Then, marry me. Not elaborate, not performed, just the plain fact of it, offered the same way he'd asked that first question on the road, directly, without decoration, like a man who meant exactly what he said and trusted her to know it. Yes, she said. The word came out without hesitation and without the feeling that she was giving anything away, which was how she knew it was right. It felt like adding something, like expanding the boundary of what was hers rather than surrendering any portion of it. He crossed the distance between them and put his arms around her, and she let him, and they stood in the hive yard in the April morning with 14 healthy hives and a full orchard in blossom around them. And it was not a perfect moment. Her veil was pushed up on her head at a crooked angle, and his boots were muddy, and somewhere in the nearest hive, a bee had decided to investigate the back of her neck with pointed curiosity. But it was real in every way that mattered, which was better than perfect had ever been. What came after was not a fairy tale ending. Leora knew better than to want one of those. What came after was more seasons, more work. The eastern end of the orchard finally reaching its full capacity in the 5th year, the pear trees exceeding even what her first assessment had suggested was possible. The honey operation growing to a scale that required her to hire help, which is how she came to take on a 15-year-old girl named Ruth Canby, daughter of a widow from Alderley who had skills she hadn't been given a proper context for, and who stood in front of a hive frame for the first time with the exact expression Leora recognized from her own earliest memories of her father's apiary. You're not scared, Leora said, watching her. Should I be? Ruth asked. No, Leora said, just pay attention. Ruth became the first of several, girls and young women who came to Rowan Orchard over the following years for reasons that were sometimes desperate and sometimes simply unmoored, looking for something solid to put their hands on. Leora didn't run a program or make announcements about it. She just said yes when the situation called for it. The same way a quiet man on a wagon had once said yes to a woman sitting in the road and taught what she knew with the same serious respect her father had given her, because she understood that knowledge passed on carefully was the most durable thing a person could leave behind. The community that had once been a source of gossip and careful avoidance became, incrementally, something different. Not all of it. There were still people in Crestfield who had opinions, and Constance Voss never entirely forgave the Frontier for failing to agree with her. But most people, Leora had found, were more interested in what you were doing than in what had happened to you. Most people, given time, evaluated you on the evidence available. The evidence at Rowan Orchard was substantial. Elsa, at the 4th Harvest Festival, bought the last jar of orchard blossom honey from Leora's stall and held it up to the light and said, "Your father would have been insufferable about this." He would have, Leora agreed. He would have talked about it to every beekeeper in 100 miles. He'd have been right to, Elsa said. This is the best honey I've ever tasted, and I've been eating honey for 50 years. Leora thought about her father often, not with the raw grief of the first years, but with the quieter, more complicated feeling that came later, when loss settled into something you carried rather than something that knocked you down. She thought about what he'd told her about bees, about paying attention, about the deal that flowers and bees had worked out between them over a time longer than anyone could measure. She thought about how he'd raised her on a very specific kind of faith, not in luck or in other people's promises, but in the reliability of honest work and real knowledge and the way a living system, given what it actually needs, tends toward health. He had been right. He'd been right about almost everything. He'd also been a difficult man to live with, prone to long silences and occasionally forgetting to express things he clearly felt. And she thought about that too, with affection rather than bitterness, because she'd married a man with similar qualities and had found that she was, apparently, suited to them. Garrick, for his part, became the kind of beekeeper she would never have predicted from the man who had gone rigid at his first hive installation. He was not gifted with bees the way she was. He didn't have her instinct, her reading of the colony's mood, the particular intuition that came from growing up inside the work. But he was steady, and he was careful, and he paid attention, which were the three things that mattered most, and the bees treated him accordingly. He got stung less than average, which she told him was a reliable indicator of a beekeeper who had learned to move honestly. Move honestly, he repeated the day she said it. What does that mean exactly? It means your body does what your intention is, she said. You're not pretending to be calm while you're nervous. You're actually calm because you actually know what you're doing. He considered this. That's a high bar. It is, she said. You clear it. He looked at her with the expression she knew best on him. The one that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to something warmer. She'd stopped trying to catalog that expression and simply let it mean what it meant. What the road had been on that June morning 4 years before a wedding that had ended everything. A dead end, a closing door, the last exit before nothing. It turned out to have been something else entirely. Not a beginning in the tidy, narrative sense. Life didn't arrange itself that neatly, and Leora had too much respect for the actual texture of things to describe it that way. It had been a redirect, the kind you didn't ask for and couldn't have planned, delivered by circumstances rather than intention. The kind that only made sense in retrospect, and even then only partially. She had sat in the dust in a ruined dress with nothing, and a man had driven by and asked a plain question, and she had answered it honestly, and everything that followed had been built from that. From the willingness to answer honestly when you had no good options and no assurance of what came next. That was the thing she tried to give the girls who came to learn from her. Not the beekeeping, though the beekeeping mattered. Not even the resilience, though they needed that too. What she tried to give them was simpler and harder than either, the understanding that the work itself was enough to build on. That skill and knowledge and the willingness to show up and pay attention were not consolation prizes for the life you'd wanted. They were the foundation of the life you actually had. The bees had always known this. They didn't build the hive once and stop. They built it continuously, each day, each season, each year, adding to what was already there, maintaining what needed maintenance, replacing what was lost. No single bee lived long enough to see the full shape of what the colony was becoming. They just did the next necessary thing, and the next, and the thing after that. And the hive was what it was because of the accumulated honesty of all those small, unremarkable acts of work. Leora had learned most of what she knew from her father. She had learned the rest from the bees. And on a late afternoon in the 5th October, the orchard at its full capacity now, the honey operation running, Garrick somewhere in the East Rows doing a pre-winter walkthrough, Ruth in the hive yard doing her first solo inspection with the focused intensity of someone who was becoming genuinely good at something. Leora stood at the edge of the property where the road passed, the same road she'd walked out on with nothing, and felt the hum of the place behind her. Not perfect, not finished. There were problems ahead she couldn't see yet, losses she hadn't had, mistakes she hadn't made, but it was hers. All of it, in the way that mattered. Not the legal way, not the sentimental way, but the real way. The way a thing is yours when you have given it your best honest attention and it has given you its best honest work in return. She stood there for a moment in the October light. Then she turned around and walked back in.